We think of Lincoln almost inextricably bound up with the Civil War. But even if there had been no Civil War, a Lincoln presidency that would have put in place that infrastructure, that banking, that tariffs, that would have been a hinge presidency by any definition. Because in real terms, Lincoln sets the economic agenda of the United States for really the next political generation, you might say, all the way up until the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, maybe even beyond to Franklin Roosevelt. In a despotism, the things that are important are things like honor, power, conquest. For Lincoln, it's more like humility, resilience, knowing the task, visibility. Those are the things that he is able to master and to communicate at large. And I think those are some of the models that we can take from Lincoln as Lincoln's gifts to us
just
today.
Welcome to Daring Greatly.
Thank you very much. It's very fine to be here.
So I want to begin with a thread that I've picked up on as we've been doing these interviews and conversations about great leaders. And it's this idea that great leaders imitate other great leaders. And when you look at Winston Churchill, for example, he had a bust of Napoleon on his desk, right? Napoleon imitated Julius Caesar, who imitated Alexander the Great, who imitated Cyrus, right? There's this, what Andrew Roberts describes as an apostolic succession of leadership. But when we come to Lincoln, who I think is arguably the greatest American statesman in history, looking at his Lyceum address, right, he actually targets Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander.
Wants to stay away from.
Wants to stay away from them. Yet at the same time, some of Lincoln's critics would compare him to Napoleon, a Caesar, and Alexander. And perhaps there's a way in which you could say that even, and we can get into how much of what Lincoln did, was a refounding, but perhaps you could even say maybe some of their more admirable qualities, perhaps Lincoln might embody, maybe not. So I'm curious what you make of this idea of and why did Lincoln target those? I think it's, maybe you could unpack what he was getting at.
Well, he's pointing in the Lyceum address in 1838 to Alexander, to Caesar, to Bonaparte as generic tyrants. And his point is not so much to open up their historical influence or significance, as if to say, this is what happens when you let passion and mob rule triumph in public life. Because that kind of activity only exasperates the widespread of decent people. And then decent people begin looking around for someone who's going to bring order out of chaos. And that's the moment, Lincoln said, that they'll turn to an Alexander or a Caesar or a Bonaparte out of desperation. And an Alexander and a Caesar and a Bonaparte, they do bring order. Oh yes, they do indeed. In some cases, the worst kind of order. But people will resort to that simply out of desperation when the laws are disregarded, when violence and mob rule become the ordinary stuff of public life. At that point, Lincoln says, when you allow that to happen, don't be surprised then that the vast run of ordinary people start looking around for a solution like that of these tyrants. But that, of course, is what he wanted people to avoid.
Sure.
For other purposes, he doesn't much refer to classical examples. The only example I can think of off the top of my head when he talks about Caesar is when he's talking about an officer who failed his officer's exam for commissioning. Lincoln wanted him commissioned anyway, so Lincoln wrote back to the examining board and said, you need to promote this man. He really has the qualifications, even if he cannot number the hairs on Julius Caesar's head.
Okay.
So apart from that, Lincoln does not really invoke much in the way of classical examples. He does, however, have some heroes in his cabinet, but they're domestic heroes. One of those heroes is Henry Clay, whom he frankly describes as his beau ideal of a statesman. He will deliver this fulsome eulogy of Clay after Clay's death in 1852, laying out the ways in which he thinks that Clay really set the ideal for American statesmanship. He also has, behind Henry Clay, a very clear admiration for George Washington. Now, part of that is, in a sense, conventional. Americans of Lincoln's day, of course, would revere Washington, and Lincoln's not going to be out of step that way. And yet, Washington does crop up at a number of points in Lincoln's public speeches. The most famous, of course, is the little speech that he gives as he's leaving Springfield, Illinois, en route to his inauguration in February of 1861. And he says that now a task rests on me, a burden rests on me, heavier than that of Washington. So he's got a comparison between the crisis he is facing and the crisis that Washington was facing in those years between the Articles of Confederation, their adoption, and the Constitutional Convention. So he sees that there's a parallel here. There's a moment of crisis in American life. At that moment, at such a moment, what does he want to compare it to? He wants to compare it to Washington. So we might say then that Henry Clay is number one, and Washington, if he's not actually number two, certainly might be said to be number 1.5 in the pantheon of Lincoln's imagination.
And I do want to circle back to Henry Clay and the Whigs, and at a later point in our conversation, are there any other classical or historic figures outside of the American tradition who you think Lincoln, really, if not modeled himself after, could be compared to, or is he, you would consider him in the pantheon of great leaders? Who else is a Lincoln-like figure from throughout history?
The only other person he puts close to those two would be Thomas Jefferson, although there's an element of ambivalence that he has about Jefferson. On the one hand, in 1859, he replies to an invitation to come to Boston and speak about Jefferson by saying that Jefferson is the one who laid out the axioms, the rules of political life. And so he'll say, all honor to Jefferson, this man who, in the Declaration of Independence, speaks so clearly and so in such an important fashion for Americans to hear. So there is a reverence for the words of Jefferson. But the ambivalence enters in with Lincoln's hesitation about the person of Jefferson.
Okay.
Because, for one thing, Jefferson represents a political tradition in American life that Lincoln did not have much sympathy with, and that is the agrarian tradition. Lincoln grows up in what you might call the darkest pit of American agricultural life in Kentucky, and especially on the Indiana frontier.
And born in 1809.
He's born in 1809. He moves with his family to Kentucky when he's 8 years old. And he simply does not like rural life. He does not like farm life. As soon as he turns 21, when the family moves yet again to Illinois, he gets off the farm, never looks back. What he wants is the world of commerce, the world of business, the world of exchange. That leads him into business 2 times himself. Both times end in failure, in bankruptcy. It creates what he likes to call the national debt, and he spends years paying it off. But it also leads him into law as a profession. And what else was law in Lincoln's day except the enforcers of commerce and trade and agreements and contracts? One historian, I think put them very much in their place for the 19th century when he said that lawyers were the shock troops of capitalism. Well, Lincoln enlists in those shock troops, and he spends the rest of his career doing that, a career which is overwhelmingly devoted to commerce and the interaction between commerce and law. So he has some difficulty reconciling himself to the Jeffersonian glorification of farm life, of agrarian independence, of the independent farmer. He's very dubious about that. He thinks that leads in the wrong directions. The other difficulty he has with Jefferson is a matter of personal morality, because people were quite well aware, and Lincoln was quite well aware then, of the rumors about Sally Hemings. We think this is a new discovery. Actually, it wasn't. People knew about this all through the 19th century.
Okay.
And in a long-lost editorial that Lincoln is supposed to have written for an Illinois newspaper, he takes out after Jefferson on this point, decrying Jefferson, saying what a terrible person Jefferson was. So there is, on the one hand, a recognition. There's a Jefferson of the Declaration of Independence that he reveres, but there's also another Jefferson that he deplores. And he's caught somewhere between those two Jeffersons. You might say he almost alternates between the two of them. That's why Jefferson is, if he stands anywhere, is going to stand at a position lower than that of Clay and Washington. In Lincoln's imagination.
Okay. And in terms of Lincoln's education, he was largely self-taught. Did he read, Plutarch's Lives? What were kind of the intellectual, inspirations for him?
We don't know. Lincoln once described his education in one word: defective. He was replying to a form that had been sent to him by Charles Lanham, who was creating this dictionary, this biographical dictionary of Congress. And Lanham, since Lincoln had served in Congress for a term in the 1840s, he gets the form and he fills it out, and it's very spare. And he uses just one word to describe the education: defective.
Defective.
Well, what did he mean by that? What he meant was that basically the only opportunities he had to go to school amounted to less than a year. Whatever other educating had to be done by himself, by his own reading. And he is, by every standard, a voracious reader. This is a man with a very lively intellectual curiosity. And you can pick up through his writings traces of so many different things, so many different writers, so many different authors. Is there system to it? Is there rhyme and reason? Is there a curriculum? Next to impossible to say. I think it's more a matter of he read whatever came within his reach.
Okay.
But when he read it, he assimilated it very directly. He had a remarkably retentive memory. And he could remember stretches of things very easily from years and years of having read them before. Some people ask, well, did he have a photographic memory? Well, it depends on how you define the term photographic memory. But let's put it this way. It was a very retentive memory. It was very acute. So he could read something and he would retain that for decades after. What does he read? We know a few things. There were school textbooks like the Kentucky Preceptor, the Columbian Orator, which combined excerpts and extracts from various writers, some of them classical writers, some of them more recent political writers. Lincoln certainly shows the impress of that. But there were other ways in which he had access, mainly through newspapers and periodicals. His law partner of many years, William Herndon, said that newspapers were his food. Now, we think of newspapers today as being little more than glorified advertising supplements. But if you read the newspapers of the 1830s, yes, there's a little bit of advertising, but it's only a very little bit. And it's very primitive. Mostly what you'll find in these newspapers is lots of political commentary and then reprints, extracts from various books that were in circulation at the time. So even if Lincoln doesn't have access directly to a particular writer's book, he may well have had access to extracts that are being reprinted in the newspapers and the magazines of the day.
And were those newspapers as equally partisan as a newspaper would be today?
Utterly partisan. There was no sense whatsoever in which these newspapers made any pretense to what we would call journalistic objectivity. The newspapers basically were party newsletters.
Okay.
They were put into place and funded by the parties. Their editors were party operatives, and they existed of, by, and for the good of a particular party. You might have a particular newspaper in one town and a newspaper in the same town, but of a different political persuasion, describing the same event, and you wouldn't know they were talking about the same event, because the way it would be described would be in utterly partisan terms. One paper would say, this person was a tremendous speaker. He won over the audience. Everybody was enthusiastic. The other paper would say, only a handful of people turned out. They were so depressed, they thought this man was a complete failure. You think, what? This is the same event.
So where did the there's a mythology around kind of, maybe it's a golden age of American journalism where it was more objective and independent. Where did that come from?
No, this is the Iron Age, if not the Rust Age of American journalism. And yet, at the same time, it's also an era which depends so heavily on these kinds of newspapers. Newspapers of Lincoln's day, as he's coming to maturity in Illinois, are basically one large sheet of paper that is folded so as to make 4 pages. And you could start up a newspaper like that with a capitalization perhaps of $300, and you could make the thing turn a profit with as little as 400 subscribers. So you would have an editor, and many times the editor is the jack of all trades. He's not only editing it, he's setting the type, he's printing it, and he's making sure it gets to the post office for distribution. Okay. Because most of the distribution happened through the post office. Newspapers at that point were free in terms of circulation in the Postal Service. So one of the large items the Postal Service has to handle in Lincoln's day is this flood of newspapers. Well, of course, that cut down subscription costs and still made it all the more economically effective to have this plethora of newspapers. You could have 3 newspapers going for every county in the United States at that point. And you would have a multiplicity of urban daily newspapers. Another thing which made them inexpensive to produce was the development of the steam-powered printing press. That cut costs likewise. You're not doing it like Benjamin Franklin did, where you actually manually have to turn the lever that prints something on a piece of paper. No, now you've got a steam engine. And the steam engine makes the printing process so much more rapid and so much more easy and more cost effective. So you could have big urban daily newspapers like the New York Tribune, the New York Herald, the New York Times. You'd have 6, 7, 8 daily newspapers going around in a major city like New York. So it is a golden age of newspapers in terms of how they're read, how many people read them, how many are being produced. Are they a high mark for the journalistic profession? Not really. But nevertheless, people love to read these things because in some senses, what else are they going to do? They don't have any other alternatives for television, for radio, for anything like that. Yeah. No podcasts. You go to the newspapers, and the newspapers are the things which help to shape your view of what's happening in the world. And as I say before, many of these newspapers, in some cases, because they have to fill up columns and fill up space, they'll reprint extracts from current literature. This to the exasperation of people who own the copyright on those books or articles that are being taken out of magazines. But who was going to be able to track down everyone who was doing that kind of lifting and reprinting? That would have required more energy than most of the copyright holders had. So you get a lot of illicit but very popular circulation of any number of treatises of political and even philosophical nature, even current literature. And all of this Lincoln, because he is such an avid reader of newspapers, Lincoln is taking all this in from this variety of sources. So in a sense, he doesn't have to read an edition of Cicero. He's able to encounter let's say, some of the great orations of Cicero. For instance, the second Catiline oration, for instance, he could encounter a translation
in
of that
the newspapers.
in one of the newspapers.
Okay.
Got an editor, had to fill up a column.
Wow, unbelievable! I couldn't imagine
it is
Cicero being, excerpted in the New York Times today.
No, I would be surprised at that myself. But in journalistic practice in the middle of the 19th century, it's a very different universe.
So you mentioned the changes in technology around the printing press. What were some of the other technological changes that were happening early in his life?
Well, for Lincoln, technology is a subject of very great interest. He's the only president, in fact, who owns a patent.
Okay.
When he was in Congress, he took the opportunity to develop a new device, which he had patented. The model for it is still in the patent office, and he is the only president who has that distinction. It was a device for floating grounded steamboats off sandbars and rivers.
Okay.
Wasn't a very practical device. I don't believe it ever got into any kind of production, and I don't think that Lincoln ever earned any money off it. But it was an idea, and it was a patent. He's very interested in transportation, whether it's steamboats that might get grounded on sandbars in the Illinois rivers, or whether it's railroads and canals. Because take them all together, railroads, canals, steamboats, these are all means, in large measure, of connecting producers to markets. The Jeffersonian ideal was that you produced on your own farm, but you also consumed on your own farm. So what you ate was what you grew. What you clothed yourself in was what you spun from the sheep or other animals on the farm. The milk you drank came from the cow. The heating you had for your home, in fact, the wood to construct it, came from the woodlot on your property. That was the Jeffersonian model of the independent farmer. Lincoln has had to grow up in that, unlike Jefferson. Lincoln knows that that is not nearly so predictable as Jefferson might have imagined. What Lincoln sees is the wonder that can take place when people who produce for someone at a market, go to the market themselves and are able to buy goods and services that they find in that market and bring back. It's the kind of division of labor that Adam Smith described in the opening of The Wealth of Nations. But to get from where you are to where that market is, that's the difficult thing. And especially in America of the 19th century, we have these enormous spaces which are still carpeted with thick coats of forest, of undergrowth, where there are no highways to speak of.
What was the state of the roads? How would you get from place to place?
We wouldn't call them much more than ruts.
Okay.
Even if that. And how can you talk about getting from where you live to a market if there's no way to get there? So transportation becomes a major issue for Lincoln. And from the very first time he's elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834, what he has to talk about mostly is about transportation issues, because transportation issues are what are going to lay the groundwork for capitalist exchange. That's what's going to bring consumers and markets together. He starts out talking about roads and roadways. He introduces bills in the state legislature for the creation of roads linking point A with point B. But then he also is very interested in canals, because canals, all right, you can move goods by overland, but it is so much less expensive and so much easier and quicker to move on waterways. Well, that's fine if a particular waterway conveniently deposits you where you want to be, but if you don't, you've got to go make a waterway, and that's what a canal is. A canal is a kind of alternate river. A canal is kind of a criticism of nature. It's saying, you didn't put that river in the place where we really need it, so we're going to divert the water into this place. He's very supportive of the construction of canals that will either connect the central Illinois rivers with the Great Lakes, or canals that will link those rivers to the Mississippi River. If you linked to the Great Lakes, well, that eventually would take you to the great commercial entrepôts of the eastern seaboard. That's quite a distance. If you linked the Mississippi River, then you had a straight shot down to New Orleans.
Yeah.
New Orleans is the emerald city of everything in America on the far side of the Appalachians. The great river systems, the Ohio, the Missouri, down to the Mississippi. This is the great commercial superhighway of the American West down to New Orleans. And New Orleans is what opens North America up to the trade of the rest of the world. We tend to think of today of New York as the great commercial entrepot. That doesn't really begin to happen until the middle of the 19th century. Still, the single greatest commercial city before the Civil War is New Orleans. So how do you open a track to New Orleans? I mean, Lincoln had experience of this very early in his life when he helps to crew flatboats of goods down the Mississippi to New Orleans. The great limitation on that was a flatboat will go with the current. What are you going to do to get back? So you can get goods down to New Orleans, but you've got a hard time getting them back the other way. The steamboat cures that. Mm-hmm. The steamboat can
go back and
forth. It's not dependent on the current.
Were they having to dredge parts of the Mississippi River?
Constantly. Yeah. They do it today. The Mississippi is a very inconstant friend. It wanders wherever it wants. So dredging is the second life of the Mississippi River, even now. But in Lincoln's day, just getting down and then back up the Mississippi, and then, of course, the Ohio or the Missouri, those were the great difficulties, and the steamboat was the means, the technological means that was going to cure that.
In what year did the steamboat
First steamboat on the Mississippi River makes the voyage all the way from Pittsburgh down to New Orleans in 1816.
Okay.
I'm plucking that date out of my memory, but if it's not exactly 1816, you'll have to pardon me. It's more or less there. It was what we regard as a very small steamboat, appropriately named the New Orleans. And after the New Orleans, the success of that premier voyage, suddenly everything opens up. And now, within 20 years, you have dozens of steamboats, larger and larger, plying the Mississippi River system. And Lincoln wants to be part of that. He would like to see the waterways of central Illinois linked to the Mississippi. And at one point, he even volunteers to serve as a pilot on a steamboat on the Sangamon River in central Illinois, a steamboat named the Talisman, because the Talisman was a shallow draft vessel that they hoped could navigate. One of the problems about the Sangamon was sandbars, shallowness. Well, they hoped the Sangamon would not be a problem for the Talisman, because the Talisman's shallow draft would allow it to evade that. Lincoln acts as the pilot. We don't often think of Lincoln as a kind of Mark Twain, but at least at that moment, he certainly is. And you might say that some 20 years later, when he's developing this invention that he patents, he's still thinking about how to float something like the Talisman off a sandbar. So transportation issues are important to him because that is how you promote commerce. That is how you promote trade. And for him, that is the world he wanted to inhabit.
So, this world that he wants to inhabit, right? It's not just a focus on transportation or commerce for commerce's sake. I think there's something underneath this kind of driving at the vision of America, the political project that he wants to.
Because for him, commerce is, as it was for Adam Smith, something that promotes friends. When you have a commercial society, you have people who have to live with each other, bargain with each other, communicate with each other. They're going to have to be fair and above board with each other, or else they're not going to be in trade. That kind of society imposes its own rules of behavior on people. Commerce is, so to speak, the economic coinage of reason.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for Lincoln, who's born at the end of the long Enlightenment, I mean, you have to think, when Lincoln is born, Thomas Paine is still alive. Franz Joseph Haydn is still alive. George III is still alive when Lincoln is born. Lincoln grows up reading what we might think of as being the classicals, books of the Enlightenment. He reads Thomas Paine. He reads from textbooks that include extracts glorifying the Enlightenment and reason. And of course, what is Jefferson asking us to do in the Declaration of Independence? But to discern the structure of reason and natural law and natural right in the universe. So for Lincoln, commerce is what introduces people to each other, introduces them to the basis of reason, because what else is commerce except reason denominated? So the value that Lincoln puts upon reason and the value that Lincoln puts upon commerce intersect with each other. Yeah. Commerce then is what's going to make people free, because commerce creates a dynamic system. The Jeffersonian agrarian system was a static system. You had property, you worked on that property, you made a living from that property, but nothing really changed up, down, in, and around. Lincoln is always thinking, what about new people? What about someone who is getting a start in life who doesn't own any property? What's going to be their lot in life? Of course, he's thinking about himself. Well, he says the ideal system is when someone starts out working for someone else. You work for someone else, you save. You save enough to go into business for yourself, buy tools for yourself, start up your own practice. You start up for yourself, and then over time, you become successful in that practice. What you do, you turn around and you hire other beginners. And this, Lincoln said, creates a circle. It creates a system, and he said, this is the ideal system. And he wants this system, as he said in 1860, to go on forever and ever, because that is what is going to promote genuine liberty. People who can choose for themselves, live the life that they want, and transform themselves into something different. You don't have to stay what you were when you were born. If you were born the son of a butcher, you don't have to be a butcher yourself. And your son doesn't have to be a butcher. You're not wedged in. It's not feudalism. For him, what capitalism represented was a dynamism that allowed people to make of themselves what they wanted. Now, does it always succeed? No. He gave a speech at the Milwaukee State Agricultural Fair in 1859, in which he said, some of you are going to be very successful in the system that I have described, and you're going to go away happy, and others are simply not going to be successful. Now, sometimes that'll be because some people are just of an indolent, dependent nature, and they're never going to make anything of themselves, and they don't really try very hard. Who was he thinking of? I can only imagine that he was thinking about a lot of the people he knew back in Indiana. But there are others, he said, they're going to fail. But at that moment, the advice he gives to them is, better luck next time.
He learned this lesson himself.
Yeah, keep trying. Keep doing it again. And there's an interesting intersection between that and the observations of a Swiss pastor named George Fish, who visited America during the Civil War years in 1863. Fish was a very sharp observer, and he noticed one thing about the American economy, and that is, he said, in Europe, if someone goes bankrupt, that ruins them for life. That's the end of their reputation. In America, someone goes bankrupt, they start over again. Yeah. And maybe they go bankrupt again. And they start over yet again. And then they make a success of themselves, and they become rich, and no one holds it against them. He thought that was one of the great contrasts between life in Europe and life in America. For Lincoln, the purpose of commerce was to assist, to uplift this power of self-transformation. And for him, it was a dynamic system, the best proof of which was his own life. Did it work in every instance? Clearly, no, it doesn't. But for Lincoln, his experience of it was people like Lincoln could come from nothing, absolute zero, and make of themselves something really remarkable. And that, of course, intersects so dramatically with his views on slavery. Because what else was slavery but a system that condemned people always to be what they had been born as? If you're born a slave, you're always going to stay a slave. This is why the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democratic tradition really didn't have too much of a problem with slavery. Since that was wedded to a notion of an economy that was static rather than dynamic, the static fixing of slaves in a position for life was simply of a piece with how the Jeffersonians understood economy as a whole. For them, static, well, they wouldn't have used the word static. They would have used the word stable. But to Lincoln, it was static. You were fixed in a position you had to be in. Lincoln once made a contrast this way. He was giving a speech in Springfield. He saw in the crowd a friend of his named John Roll. And he pointed to Roll and he said, now, that man Roll there, look at how he has succeeded in life. He said, look at how I have succeeded in life. Lincoln said, I was once a slave. You think, wait a minute, no, you weren't born into slavery. Well, if you'd ask Lincoln, the kind of relationship he had to have with his father wasn't too far removed from that. Growing up on the farm in Indiana, everything Lincoln earned, he had to turn over to his old man. He disliked that hugely. So he says, I was once a slave, but now I am so free they let me practice law. For Lincoln, all right, he's making a humorous point of it. But the humorous point, and this often happens with Lincoln, the humorous point comes back to his own experience. And what he believes is the experience that can be shared by everyone. He once said during the war years, when he had to address a review of some Midwestern soldiers who were parading out in front of the White House, he said, what are we fighting this war about? We are fighting this war so that any one of your sons can come and live in this big white house the same way my father's son has done so. The dynamism of the American system was what he thought was the most remarkable trait of American life. That dynamism could only operate in an environment of freedom, and it can only operate when you do not have the thick, enveloping fog of slavery paralyzing it. And paralysis is what he saw slavery producing.
And then so this vision then of, a banking system, internal improvements, tariffs, right? Harnessing the power of technology, crushing the economic engine of slavery, even I think achieving economic independence from Great Britain, right? This was really central to the Whig vision and to Henry Clay's
it was. I mean,
economy.
Lincoln is, politically speaking, Lincoln is a Whig for most of his political life. I mean, today the word Whig doesn't really ring any bells for people. But the Whig Party begins in the 1830s as an organized political party under the leadership of Henry Clay. And it has diverged entirely from the economic model of the Jeffersonians and the Jacksonians. What Henry Clay wants to develop, and this becomes what he calls his American system, is a three-pronged economic plan. First of all, you have to have a national banking system. Secondly, you have to have protective tariffs. And thirdly, you have to have internal improvements. Well, internal improvements, today we would call that infrastructure. And that infrastructure is the kind of thing Lincoln was talking about in the legislature when he's talking about roads and canals and eventually railroads. The other two are also linked in the same way, because a national banking system, what does a national banking system do? All right, for one thing, it accumulates concentrations of capital, which can then be invested and you can create a manufacturing base with that. So that's one aspect of things. But even more, when you have a national banking system, you also have the emission of a currency, a medium of exchange. And Lincoln thought having that medium of exchange is what makes commerce so much the more easy. I mean, if there's a physical difficulty that transportation, that infrastructure and internal improvements are supposed to cure, then there's also a difficulty in exchange itself. Because what is a farmer going to do? If you go to a particular market and you see goods you want to buy, what are you going to do? Are you going to say, well, I would offer you 3 cows for this hat? First of all, you're not entirely sure what denomination cows come in. Secondly, you've got to spend a lot of time and effort getting them to market. How much easier if you just have cash to take and buy the hat? Who's going to issue the cash? The bank. We tend to think of cash today as currency which is emitted by the federal government. That will come later during Lincoln's presidency. In the years before the Civil War, you had paper currency, but it was all emitted by banks. Now that
regional banks,
regional,
okay.
Local, whatever. There's scarcely anything you can call a national system for banking. Now that creates a difficulty because you could have a bank here issuing banknotes that might arouse a certain degree of suspicion over here. You know, who printed these? What bank did they come from?
Yeah.
This is one reason, by the way, that the most popular periodical in America before the Civil War were the bank circulars. Bank circulars were literally indexes of banks informing you how reliable their banknotes were. So if you had any significant business, you kept a bank circular with you because you never knew when someone would walk in with a banknote from, I don't know, Bangor, Maine.
Yeah.
How were you going to judge that? Look it up in the bank circular. Well, having cash, no matter what bank it's coming from, is so much simpler than when you take it to a market. And there you can exchange that. And the person you're buying something from will accept those banknotes. I mean, after they've looked them up, but they'll accept the banknotes because that's easier for them. If you brought 3 cows to buy a hat, what are they going to do with the 3 cows? So you've got a number of difficulties which get solved by a banking system. The great problem, of course, is the irregularity, not being able to be entirely sure. How do you create dependability? This is what will happen during the Civil War when Lincoln signs the National Banking Act, because that's going to create a uniform paper currency for the entire nation. That means no matter where you go, you're using the same notes, the same paper currency, and everyone will recognize it. Think about the ease of exchange that takes place in that environment. So, a national banking system, and then protective tariffs. When the American Republic achieves its independence, it achieves that independence pretty much as an agricultural nation. And this was a product of deliberate planning on the part of the British Empire. British Empire wanted to be a center for manufacturing. The British Empire was in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, and it was converting a great deal of its productive capabilities to industrial production. Well, what do you want? Do you want your colonies competing with you? No, you don't. So a great deal of what went on in the British legislation that regulated the American economy before the Revolution was making sure that there would not be this kind of manufacturing competition in America, that America basically would be the agricultural resource that fed the workers in the British industrial system. Well, we achieve our independence. And we achieve our independence without any industrial base.
So we're still stuck in the colonial economic
We're
system.
still stuck in that. We've got to buy weapons from the French, which of course puts us deep in debt at the very beginning of the Republic. And that's a whole other story.
Sure.
But how do you develop a manufacturing? Alexander Hamilton scratched his head no end trying to figure out, all right, how can we promote this? How can we promote a manufacturing? I mean, first of all, because that helps Americans compete. Secondly, it keeps us safe. Because what if the British decide that they'd like to have Revolution 2.0?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, we had that. It's called the War of 1812. We went to war against the British. We went to war against the British. We couldn't even manufacture the uniforms for our soldiers' backs.
Really?
It was that bad. It was that bad. The only reason that we do not lose the War of 1812 is because the British are so distracted with what's happening with Bonaparte in Europe.
Hmm.
And if it hadn't been for that distraction,
Wow.
as it is, it was a much closer run thing than we sometimes imagine. Well, coming out of the experience of the War of 1812, Clay in particular is determined the United States, for its own national security, has got to develop its own manufacturing base. But how do we do it when the British are emitting so much in the way of cheap manufactured goods and dumping them on the American markets? Okay, we have to have protective tariffs. So protective tariffs become a third component in this Whig American system. Lincoln grasps hold of the American system from the very start. From Lincoln's first political utterances, he's talking about infrastructure. He's talking about banking. When he's a state legislator, he's talking about an Illinois state bank. And the great virtue of that, he says, is that it puts a dependable circulating medium into the hands of everybody in Illinois. And then he wants protective tariffs. And he will ring the changes on those three things all through his career as a Whig. One of his first big speeches as a member of Congress in the late 1840s is a speech about tariffs. And when he's president, no surprise, what do you get? You get the highest tariffs in American history. Overall, basic average of 49% tariffs being levied on imports. What do you get? You get that national banking system. And you even could say to a certain degree that you get infrastructure. Because although there's a war on, two things are noticeable about it. One is it's how important the railroads are to the Union war effort. There is one point at which one whole section of the Army of the Potomac, the 11th and 12th Corps, the Army of the Potomac, are shifted from the Eastern Theater to the Western Theater. They do it in 11 days by the railroads. They don't have to march over the Appalachians. So the railroads emerge as this enormously important factor in the Union victory in the Civil War. But also Lincoln himself is encouraging the construction of railroads during the war and signs the bill for the single biggest railroad infrastructure project in American history, which is the Transcontinental Railroad, which is going to be a mixed public-private venture with the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, building from the ends to the middle, and doing it basically with government loan guarantees. And even the outright gift of government-owned public property. If Lincoln had not died in 1865, I have this image of the hammering of the Golden Spike, that moment at Promontory Point, Utah, when the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific come together. I have this image of Lincoln presiding at that, because Lincoln is the person really who makes that possible. So that Whig project of infrastructure, of banking, of tariffs, that's the guiding post of Lincoln's politics, even after the Whig Party disintegrates in 1856.
It's really the foundation of the Republican Party
and moves it, and because the Republican Party itself, probably the single largest component of the Republican Party, was old Northern Whigs like Lincoln. So no surprise then that Lincoln will bring that political project over into the development of the Republican Party. So much so that critics on the Democratic side of it would attack Lincoln as being just another good old Western Whig. And he himself would say, he says this, in fact, to Missouri Senator John Henderson when he is soliciting Henderson's support for the 13th Amendment. He says to Henderson, "You and I are good old Henry Clay Whigs, aren't we?" And I think there's an element of truth, certainly an element of truth in that. For him, the old Whig agenda really becomes the economic agenda of the American future. And Lincoln is the key figure in putting that into place. I've sometimes said, and I hope not recklessly, we think of Lincoln almost inextricably bound up with the Civil War. But even if there had been no Civil War, a Lincoln presidency that would have put in place that infrastructure, that banking, that tariffs, that would have been a hinge presidency by any definition. Because in real terms, Lincoln sets the economic agenda of the United States for really the next political generation. You might say all the way up until the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, maybe even beyond to Franklin Roosevelt.
Yeah, and which was foundational to America becoming the greatest economic power, military power in the world.
No question. No question.
And interesting too, it's just totally antithetical to what the South and the Confederacy stood for. Even if you read, the Confederate Constitution, they remove tariffs, internal improvements. They're kind of gutting all of these kind of core, Whig components.
And you can see why, because if you look at that kind of program from the Jeffersonian and Jacksonian point of view, what you see is an economy of constant transformation. If there's one thing a slave-owning economy does not want to promote, transformation. You don't want change, because a slave who changes becomes a free person. You want to avoid that. You want slavery, and you want it to stay the same. You want the structures to stay the same. You don't want any challenge. You don't want any transformation. So you don't want tariffs because you're really not interested in manufacturing. You have some in the South, but it's not valorized. So you don't want to promote that. So you don't want tariffs to protect it. You don't really need infrastructure. I mean, one reason you don't need infrastructure is because the Southern river system is a lot friendlier than the Northern river system. The Southern river system is wonderfully connected to coastal export entrepot, and that's a feature of the Southern economy that we sometimes miss. But it also meant that they didn't really see a need for developing the interior by means of railroads or canals or so forth. I mean, there are railroads in the South, but it's very limited, very rickety. They don't hold up well during the Civil War. And above all, there's no interest whatsoever in a national banking system, which in some respects comes back to bite them, because the Confederate government's management of the economy was a catastrophe on wheels. And that is one of the things which helps to bring about the defeat of the Confederacy. So in some respects, they got what they asked for. But it was a very different vision from Lincoln's. And when you talk about a future for the United States, if you think for a moment what a future Confederacy would have been, you have to shake your head. It would have been a republic. It would have been an economy of slavery. And over time, I'm sure the slave-based labor system would have transformed itself simply by the necessities of the world markets into a labor system that would not be just limited to agriculture, because there's nothing that necessarily says that slaves have to be cotton-picking slaves. You could easily imagine a future in an independent Confederacy where you do develop something more of a manufacturing base, but the labor system always remains that of slaves. That could easily have been an American future. That's the moment when you realize how very grateful you are for a Union victory in the Civil War. There are some senses in which, even with the defeat of the Confederacy, the Southern economy for almost a century after the Civil War is still stuck in the old system. The idea of racial segregation is... Jim Crow is the biggest economic loser you can imagine, because it basically says, if there are people of talent who don't happen to belong to a particular race, we will ignore their talents. We will not try to profit and benefit as a society from their talents. We will instead segregate them into backwaters. What else is that but a kind of economic suicide? But this is what the South manages to do in the decades after the Civil War, and the Southern economy suffers for it. The Southern economy doesn't even come close to anything with the parity of the rest of the American economy until well into the 20th century. That's not an accident. They wanted that, and they got it.
So I want to get to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Lincoln-Douglas debates before we get to his presidency. But before that, I do want to talk about his religious upbringing. This Calvinist Baptist kind of foundation, which even though he kind of abandoned some of those Calvinist religious roots, kind of keeps something like there's a deterministic, even a fatalistic component to the way he approaches his philosophy. What was his religious upbringing like in his relationship with religion?
His parents belonged to a very small Baptist sect of Calvinistic theological persuasion. And when you say Calvinistic, it doesn't necessarily mean everybody was reading John Calvin, but it does mean that what they embraced as their chief identifying feature was the doctrine of predestination. That everything that you see, everything that happens, all this is a decree of God. God is a supremely sovereign and powerful God. God controls all events whatsoever comes to pass. Well, that being the case, then you understand that everything you think, everything you say, everything you do has been determined beforehand. And Lincoln grows up in that environment. That's the kind of preaching he hears. That's the kind of catechizing that he gets. And it doesn't, in many ways, it doesn't take with him. I mentioned before that he did not have the happiest relationship with his father, Thomas Lincoln. And that extended not only to work and life on the farm, it also extended to just about everything else. And Lincoln, in his adolescence, already is separating himself, pulling himself back from the religion of his parents, and especially of his father. He knows what the content of it is, but he doesn't accept it personally. And yet, the thumbprint of it, that stays with him for the rest of his life, that habit of thinking of every event as being in some way determined. Now, why that will continue to be a living force in his life is where the Enlightenment intersects with that. I spoke of Lincoln as being a man of the Enlightenment, which he is. The authors that he reveres the most are the people probably best known for religious skepticism. And he never joins a church, never makes any kind of religious profession of any sort. When people try to pin him down on his religion, he gets very evasive. He knows it's not good politics. Early in his life, he had a reputation as being something of a cocky 20-something who scorned religion and made fun of religion.
Didn't he actually write a pamphlet or a book, The Crying Christian, that someone told him to burn?
He is supposed to have written a little essay attacking Christianity, which so scandalized some friends of his, one in particular, that this person took and threw it in the fire.
Wow.
Burn this thing up. Not just because it's bad, but because the reputation is going to hurt you. He learns over time that it's not such a good idea to air these ideas. This is an overwhelmingly Protestant Christian culture, and he's swimming against the tide that way. But he's guided in his thinking that way by the Enlightenment authors he's reading, and it is a curious feature of the Enlightenment that so much of Enlightenment science was geared towards notions of determinism. This time scientific determinism, not theological, but scientific determinism, but still determinism. So he can find a comfortable niche there. And that determinism will continue to guide his thinking all through the rest of his life. He will look at people and situations, and he will define them in terms of what has shaped them, what has made them what they are. Not so much what they do for themselves, but as what they inevitably have to become. Now, this sets up an unusual contrast in Lincoln. Because on the one hand, here's a man who, certainly in economic terms, devoutly believes in the power and the joy of self-transformation. But at the same time, who's constantly telling people that he doesn't believe that people have the capacity to transform themselves. And there's a conflict there that never gets entirely resolved. He works at it all through his life, but he never entirely resolves it. And to a certain degree, it's a conflict that is inherent in Calvinist theology itself. Because you're always attempting to ask people of a Calvinist loyalty. Well, if God determines all things, why do you bother to get up in the morning? Why even try?
Sure.
And the answer comes back in a variety of ways. There's a number of solutions people have offered for this apparent conundrum. But it's not an unusual problem. And the curious thing is that those people who have been the most convinced of some kind of deterministic control of human events, whether it's a theological conviction like Oliver Cromwell, or a purely secular conviction like Karl Marx. These are the people who've actually made things happen. And here's the great irony of this. The people who have been most convinced that everything has been foredetermined are the people most likely to get out in front and make something occur. And I think the only answer you can come up with to that is that sense of determinism is what gives you confidence that when you do something, it's going to have a real effect.
Yeah.
So I think for Lincoln, the way he makes these two work together is the sense that it's exactly because there is something predetermined that you can move in that direction with confidence.
And so in his Lyceum address, right, Lincoln is talking about an American civil religion, right? He's kind of laying out that case, talking about reverence for laws, right, as opposed to mob rule. There's reverence for the Constitution, for the Declaration of Independence, and the language he uses is explicitly religious, right?
Yes.
He even concludes, by saying that the gates of hell shall not prevail over America. So I'm curious.
His image is of the mother catechizing her child in her lap.
Yeah.
Teaching them, this is how you should obey the law. All right, well, that's no different than if you were a mother catechizing a child.
So, yeah, absolutely fascinating. So in the absence of an established church in America, it strikes me as it's I don't know if you'd say inevitable, but highly likely that a civil religion would form, right, and would fill perhaps that vacuum. And I think Lincoln kind of sketches out what that would be. What's your reading on that American civil religion? How does that religion change over time, and how do you square that, I guess, with is it simpatico with Christianity, or is it in conflict with Christianity?
Well, I think that there's a general compatibility.
Okay.
He doesn't lay out specific points of what this civil religion would be. In fact, if anything, he's talking less about the components of the civil religion. There's really only one component, that's reverence for law. What he's really getting at is the energy with which you promote that, the energy with which you surround that law keeping. That's why he'll speak in terms of reverence for law. You come to the law with almost the same attitude of spirituality and spiritual submission that you would come to God with. So you have reverence for God. All right, fine. You're also going to have reverence for the law. And reverence for the law is what is going to guarantee stability and freedom in a society, because it's going to remove the temptation to resort to the Caesars, the Alexanders, and the Bonapartes. But it is an attitude that he wants to have people cultivate. For him, he's very reluctant to get involved, even while he's president, in trying to dictate any particular religious formula or solutions. He will, for instance, restrain a number of his officers who are busy trying to impose martial law on churches.
Interesting.
When you have Union forces that have occupied stretches of the Confederacy, well, in the churches of those stretches, what are the people praying for? Are they praying for Jefferson Davis or for Abraham Lincoln? Some of them are still praying for Jefferson Davis. Union military officers objected to this. They did not want sedition being encouraged on Sunday mornings. So you have several incidents, probably the most famous being the one involving a Presbyterian pastor named Samuel McPheeters in St. Louis. And McPheeters gets arrested by the local military authorities. Lincoln has to intervene and basically says to his soldiers on the ground, it is not the business of the government to run the churches. At the same time, though, he applauds the churches that support the Union war effort. He particularly salutes the Methodists. He didn't have a whole lot of personal exposure himself to the Methodists. Methodists are not Calvinists. But he certainly saluted the energy with which the Northern Methodists had supported the war effort. But he does the same thing for a number of other church groups that he meets with, whether they are Baptists, whether they're Reformed Presbyterians. He's grateful for their support. He thinks that their support is integral to the war effort itself. But he never is going to get to the point of actually saying, you believe what I believe, or I believe what you believe. People do try to pin him down on that. One congressman from Connecticut, Henry Deming, tried to get Lincoln to give a sort of explicit endorsement of whatever religion it was he felt he could endorse. What church would you join if you could? And Lincoln's response to it is a model of evasion. Lincoln says, whenever a church would engrave over its door as the sole basis for membership, the words, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself, that church will I willingly join. But you could walk away from saying, finally, Lincoln has told us. Except that by the time you've walked away, you realize, wait a minute, there isn't any such church.
Yeah.
And so, as I say, this is a model of indirection. And indirection was something Lincoln had learned to do very well as a political figure. He will not identify himself that way. And yet, the churches he does attend, First Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Illinois, New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in Washington, they are old school, old Calvinist churches. So in a sense, he does gravitate still in those directions. He's not going to join them. But these are the churches that if he's going to be part of any kind of church activity, that's what he feels comfortable with. Now, was he diligent in attending them? No. One Springfield pastor complained about Lincoln, in a very gentle way, but still as a complaint. Said Lincoln's a very honest man, a very moral man. But on Sunday mornings, he usually spends his time down at the railroad station reading the newspapers and talking shop with the workmen.
Okay.
Even in the White House, witnesses there observed that Lincoln read the Bible, but the young lady who was more or less the babysitter for the Lincoln boys, for Tad and for Willie, the first year when they were in the White House, Julia Taft Bain, she said afterwards in a short memoir she wrote, she said, yeah, Lincoln read the Bible, but he read it in the attitude of someone who was simply reading a good book. And Orville Hickman Browning, whom he'd known from years before practicing law in Illinois, and who was serving as U.S. Senator from Illinois in the first year of the war, Browning would often come to the White House on Sundays, and Browning was struck by the fact that Lincoln never had prayers. There was no table grace or anything like that at dinner. And that struck Browning as odd because Browning was a Presbyterian elder. So there was never anything that looked like overt religious practice in Lincoln. And yet, always when you're talking about Lincoln, those become the two most frequent words, and yet. This is also someone who very early in the war finds his thinking revolving in curiously religious directions. And I think in large measure because the war itself, by 1862, has gone in directions he could not predict, much less understand. You would have thought that in a cause like that of preserving the Union, in suppressing rebellion and treason, you would have thought that all the justice in the universe would have been on the side of the Union, and there would have been a quick end to the affair. And there wasn't. By the middle of 1862, the Confederate armies have been frequently victorious, embarrassingly so. The Confederacy has not been subdued. And it's starting to look like it might be a whole lot harder, if even impossible, to subdue it. And this sends Lincoln to thinking. He writes out something that is later entitled Memorandum on the Will of God. And it's very typical of Lincoln that it reads a whole lot like a geometrical theorem. But he starts off with the proposition, the will of God prevails. Okay, of course the will of God prevails. If God's will hadn't prevailed, then he's really not God, and you have to go find out who the real God is. All right, the will of God prevails. From that, Lincoln says, all right, next step. In this war, each side is appealing to God for justification and for support. Now, if God was for the North or if God was for the South, then by a simple intervention on his own, he could have made either one or the other victorious by now. That hasn't happened. That's not because he doesn't lack the willpower. The will of God prevails. What could be the reason? The reason must be that there must be some other aim that God has in view for this war than just the suppression of rebellion. And therefore, God has allowed this war to continue because he wants us to grope our way towards that other goal. You can see where he's going.
I see where he's going. It all is very beautifully written. He picks up on this in the second inaugural. What I kind of am curious about, though, is there any sense in which there's a pushing off of responsibility? What if his military tactics had been different? I mean, does that ever cross his?
No. For him, he's thinking in very large terms of what is happening. And what he sees is the nation itself as a whole being directed in a path that it could never have predicted and probably never would have wanted to travel. But the war has become the means by which the nation is going to make this journey. And this will continue to crop up repeatedly in communications Lincoln has with people. He will talk by 1864 about God guiding these events. We don't understand them. God has a reason for them that we don't comprehend. All we can do is try to follow by the best lights that we have in understanding it. But it's very clear, we're following the lead that God is giving. When he begins to talk about God in this way, he's not talking about some distant, faceless deity. We're not talking about a deism of a great watchmaker or clockmaker in the sky. We're talking about someone who gets intimately involved with human events, who is directing human events. And that kind of a personal God, that kind of discussion is something that you didn't find in the Lincoln of the 1830s or the 1840s. The Civil War has forced him to come to grips with this. And it does, as you say, it does show up most dramatically in the second inaugural. The second inaugural it starts off as being a fairly commonplace. I mean, he says there's less need at this second appearing for a big speech than there was back in 1861. What we now realize is that slavery was the cause of the war. And we're hoping that this war is going to come to a swift conclusion. And then it pivots. I've sometimes said to students, as we've worked our way through the second inaugural, that the most important word in the second inaugural is if. Because that's the hinge on which the inaugural turns from just being the straightforward statement of, all right, here's where we're at politically and militarily, to this extraordinary speculation on why it has happened the way it has. If we shall suppose, but he sets this up by saying, here you have North and South. They're both praying to the same God. They're reading the same Bible. Why is the result so different? Well, the result is different because God has an intention here. But bear this in mind, Lincoln says. This result is not North is absolutely right, South is absolutely wrong. No, he's saying North and South alike have been wrong. The judgment of this war is a judgment on the entire country because North and South alike have had their hands imbrued in the evil of slavery. And so we have seen every drop of blood drawn by the lash, paid for by one drawn by the sword. And that's for North and South alike. And if you Northerners do not like being told that, if you do not like being told that the cause of this war lies as much in your hands as in those of the South, morally speaking, then don't argue with me. Argue with God, because you find it written that the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Because it is God who has brought this judgment on, not me. It is God who has brought this judgment on us. Now, how do we respond in that judgment? That's what brings people to that final glowing paragraph of the second inaugural. With malice toward none, with charity for all. Why? Why malice? Why the absence of malice? Why charity? Why the cultivation of charity? Why does that become an issue for him? Because at that moment, that's when you realize that you are not in control of events. And therefore, when you're talking about responsibility, you don't exact a pound of flesh from the Confederacy because you realize you have been as guilty as that. The appropriate response is not vengeance, because vengeance is as toxic for democracies as any other political poison. You show malice toward none and charity for all because you recognize that this is an event greater than the scope of your responsibility. You realize that Southerners have been brought to judgment and Northerners have been brought to judgment alike. And now that judgment has been passed. And under the judgment of this great God who controls all events, is there any other possible, appropriate response of North and South to each other except that of showing no malice, showing only charity? In a way, that is the ultimate expression of that ancestral Calvinism. We don't have power of our own to assess judgment. All we have the power to do is to avoid malice and to cultivate charity. He wrote afterwards, a political operative, very influential one, Thurlow Weed, wrote to him to congratulate him on the inaugural. And he said, thanks for your word. Everyone loves a compliment. But he said, I don't think the inaugural is going to be well received by a lot of people, because people do not like being shown that God has a controversy with them. But he said, I still think it needed to be said, because that is what the believers in a living God believe. And it was up to me to say it.
Wow.
So with Lincoln, you are dealing with someone who is talking about a living personal God. It still doesn't conform. It's an idea that doesn't conform to any of what you might call the creeds or confessions of organized churches. And yet he has come quite a distance from the smart aleck who's writing this little pamphlet about how awful it is to try to believe in Christianity. Is what he winds up with at the end Christianity? You can't really say that because there's nothing in the second inaugural that talks about the Christian themes
Sure.
of atonement and redemption. And yet at the same time, if it's not an explicitly Christian theme, he is still not talking about some remote machine in the skies just making things happen. Always with Lincoln, and yet becomes the phrase.
So on the issue of slavery, he long believed it was intrinsically evil, right? But in his first inaugural, he argues, right, that his aim is to contain slavery in the states where it exists and to not allow it spread. And then presumably through his economic policies and other things, slavery would eventually kind of die out. Where did he move? At what point did he move from that point of view to abolition, and why?
Well, he always said, as he commented to Charles Sumner, talking about the abolitionist, he said to Sumner, the difference between you and me is only 6 weeks. So people who criticized him for being an abolitionist, he said, well, I'm not an abolitionist, but I'm mighty near one. He's not an abolitionist, first of all, because he has a certain understanding of human nature. Human nature does not change overnight. There's the Calvinism at work again. Human nature just doesn't change on a dime. You only make big changes gradually. And in a way, that is also a kind of an Enlightenment idea. Dr. Johnson said the same thing in many of his essays. You don't introduce change as a radical solution to problems. Lincoln always has the instinct of the gradual. Let us move slowly and carefully as we move. And in that respect, he would speak of abolition as something which, yes, a desirable goal, but a goal toward which we work. He liked gradualism because gradualism, he said, especially in the context of slavery, would allow the two races, as he put it, to work themselves out of their old relationship and into a new one. In other words, he wanted therapy rather than shock therapy. But he's a gradualist in the most general sense because he believes that that's what human beings are really, at the end of the day, only capable of, is very gradual movement. So when he talks about emancipation, straight up until 1862, he talks about it as having several different components. One is gradualism. In other words, you're going to emancipate, but it's going to be on a timetable. It's going to be compensated. In other words, you're going to pay off the owners, which strikes people today as very strange, almost as strange as gradualism, because you're saying, wait a minute, the people who were wronged here were the slaves. Why are you giving money to the slave owners? Well, there's a reason. But the third thing is it should be voluntary. What he meant by voluntary was not people got to make the decision on their own hook. What he was talking about was a popular vote. That, I think, holds one of the major keys to understanding Lincoln's thinking about emancipation and abolition. We talk about slavery in the southern states, and we wonder, why doesn't Lincoln want to move at once to abolish slavery in the southern states? Why doesn't he, the day after the firing on Fort Sumter, why doesn't he declare all the slaves of the South freed? Well, understand what he regards the Confederacy as being. The Confederacy is a nullity. Right? The Confederacy does not, he never uses the term Confederate States of America because he regards this business about the secession of the Confederate States as a constitutional and legal impossibility. You can't secede from the Union. There's no secession. Where's the secession provision in the Constitution? Where's the reversion clause in the Constitution? So he's constantly questioning, the Confederacy doesn't have any. The Confederacy is not independent. It's not a nation. It's not sovereign. It is simply an insurrection. It's a rebellion. And our obligation, especially my obligation as president, is to suppress the insurrection the same way we suppressed the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania when Washington went there to basically to arrest people for treason. So the Confederacy doesn't exist. that means the states that compose the Confederacy are still part of the United States, whether they like to say so or not. If they are still part of the United States, and here's the hitch. Slavery in the United States was always a matter of state law. There is no incorporation doctrine in constitutional law in Lincoln's day. Even as President of the United States, he does not have the authority to reach over that firewall between state and federal jurisdictions and simply emancipate slaves on his own decree. He can't issue an executive order to do that. I mean, for one thing, there is no such thing at this point as an executive order. But even if there was, he doesn't have the authority to do that. He certainly couldn't do it in the 4 slave states that remained in the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And people say, why not? Why didn't he emancipate the slaves there? Because he is only the President of the United States, which is a shocking realization. It's not an elective monarchy. He's the President of the United States. He can't do that unilaterally. Because if he tried, then the next morning at 9 a.m., every slaveholder in those states, those 4 states, would be in federal court screaming for an injunction, and they would get it. And from there, it would get appealed through the district courts up to the United States Supreme Court. And who was the Chief Justice at that moment of the United States Supreme Court? Roger Brooke Taney, the author of the Dred Scott decision. If Taney had gotten his hands on an emancipation case, he could have blown the whole proposition straight to pieces for the next political generation. People rumored that Taney, in fact, had an opinion already pre-written.
Really?
Striking down emancipation. Lincoln always knows that that is where this kind of thing can end. And that's where he doesn't want it to end. So, hands off slavery in the border states, hands off any kind of presidential decree about slavery in the Confederate States, and even before the Civil War. Hands off any political project that talks about abolishing slavery. What he will want to do in the years running up to his election is to talk about preventing the extension of slavery into the Western territories. Because it was generally believed, even by slaveholders themselves, that slavery required new room to expand in order to survive. So Lincoln's feeling is, all right, build a Berlin Wall around the states where slavery is legal. Let slavery asphyxiate on its own. He thought that was a very possible result, and so did the slave owners. That's why they seceded or tried to secede from the Union. So up to that point, he's willing to say, no, we're not going to try to abolish slavery. We're going to make it possible for slavery to abolish itself. The war changes this. And eventually, he's going to try, first of all, to persuade those 4 border states to abolish slavery on their own hook. In fact, he's even going to try to bribe them, frankly. He offers the state of Delaware $700,000 in United States bonds if the state legislature of Delaware will abolish slavery in Delaware and use that money to compensate slave owners. There were only 1,700 slaves in Delaware.
Okay.
So it's practical. It can happen. But the border states throw it right back in his face. And so finally, by the fall of 1862, he's decided on another strategy. And that is the war powers strategy. All right. He's commander-in-chief by virtue of the Constitution. If you're going to be commander-in-chief, then there certainly should be certain war powers that inhere in being commander-in-chief. War powers that will help the federal government win the war. What is one excellent way to help the federal government win the war? Emancipate the slaves of the Confederacy. Declare them free, because then they won't be able to be used for military duties. Great idea. Of course, you weren't thinking that was going to happen the next morning and everybody was going to walk free. But what's worth noticing is that the Emancipation Proclamation only frees slaves in the Confederacy. It doesn't free slaves in the border states. And people have long wondered, why? Is it because Lincoln really didn't care about them? Is Lincoln only doing this because he's trying to win the war for the Union? Well, the answer is actually a good deal more humdrum, but a good deal more obvious. He's issuing this proclamation on the strength of his title as Commander-in-Chief. He can only do it as a war power. Therefore, he can only do it with those places that are at war with the United States, which is the Confederacy. Border states aren't at war, but he can't do it there. Again, if he tried to do it, that scenario I described before would kick in. So the Emancipation Proclamation is limited in its scope. But the reason for it is not because Lincoln was half-hearted. It was because constitutionally, this was the only avenue he saw. And even there, he wasn't entirely sure about how strong a branch it was he was shinnying out on. Because he will say, I'm convinced the proclamation is constitutional, but we're not going to really know until the courts decide after the war is over. That is why he wanted the 13th Amendment so badly. And he wanted it before the war ended. Because an amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery would end the thing completely and put it beyond the reach of the courts. That was why he called it, after the 13th Amendment is adopted by Congress, the King's cure for all the evils. That finishes it up. So he moves to a position, and he will say, frankly, I have moved to this position because I have had to move to this position of abolition. George Stewart, who headed the Christian Commission, visited with Lincoln at the White House on one occasion and congratulated Lincoln on all that had been accomplished in ending slavery. And Lincoln said, look, I don't deserve any credit for it. You don't deserve any credit for it. Because if it hadn't been for those people across the river, we would never have been able to do this. There you hear Lincoln, the constitutionalist. You still hear an echo of Lincoln, the Calvinist. All of that goes into the complexity of understanding how Lincoln operates as a president, as the great emancipator, and as a human being.
So shortly after the second inaugural address, the war comes to an end. His untimely death, his assassination, we never really get to see that second term, which we can speculate on. I'm curious, what do you think in terms of his legacy? We talked about his legacy in terms of policy, right? But in terms of character as a leader, what do you think are those core qualities of political leadership that Lincoln embodied?
Well, there are certainly a number of things that Lincoln shows us that are particular to leadership and statesmanship in a democracy. One is humility. It's a sense of limits. People who aspire to leadership or statesmanship in a democracy do so in an environment where they have to understand that the people are sovereign. And the reason that we have elections is so that the people can hold their officers accountable. That's what elections are about. They're about accountability. We elected you to do A, Y, and Z. And if you haven't done A, Y, and Z, then we're going to replace you with someone else who will do that. That's what elections are about. That means that you have to have a certain respect for the decisions people make. You have to have a respect for that sovereignty. That's the kind of humility. It's not the humility of a Uriah Heep. It is the humility of someone who understands, I'm only in this position for a limited time and with the mandate that the people have given to me. And I can't fall short of that, but I can't go beyond it. And Lincoln inhabits that. There's another aspect here too, and that is resilience. Lincoln is capable of absorbing a tremendous amount of punishment. People will, we think today of Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial or on the $5 bill. Who could possibly criticize or demean Abraham Lincoln? Oh my goodness, during his presidency, the things he was called. Even before he began, even before he was inaugurated, one Illinois editor asked in a piece that he wrote in his newspaper, who will write this ignorant man's state papers for him? Now, we're on the other side of the second inaugural and the Gettysburg Address, and we think, oh, that guy got it wrong. But this was the kind of thing that was said about Lincoln. He was bitterly criticized. He was criticized by newspapers that didn't like his policies, that said, well, Abraham Lincoln is emphatically the colored man's president and the white man's curse. This is what one Pennsylvania newspaper said. And there were others who weren't shy about saying, as an Iowa newspaper said after his reelection, who will plant a dagger in this tyrant's bosom?
Strong stuff.
Yes, if there'd been a Secret Service in those days, the editor would probably have gotten a visit. But there wasn't one. That's the kind of press coverage Lincoln was getting. Did he obsess over it? Did he sit up nights worrying about it? No. No, he displayed a remarkable capacity for absorbing that kind of opposition, hatred, sometimes in our minds, this unimaginable degrees of fury. And he would do that almost with a shrug of the shoulders. Case in point, he loved the theater. He loved Shakespeare in particular. Could quote reams of Shakespeare off by memory. And he got interested in a particularly prominent Shakespearean actor named James Hackett. He had Hackett come and do a kind of a command performance of Shakespearean soliloquies at the White House. And afterwards, he sat down and talked Shakespearean shop with Hackett, almost like a very talented amateur with a professional. I could almost picture George Will talking baseball, with a baseball bat, with Earl Weaver, back in the days of Weaver's managing the Baltimore Orioles. And unwisely, afterwards, Hackett wrote a piece for a newspaper describing Lincoln saying these things. The newspapers erupted in criticism. What kind of a joker president do we have that he hangs out with actors and is talking about acting on the stage? And Hackett wrote to Lincoln so embarrassed, apologizing so profusely. Lincoln wrote back to him, basically said, don't worry about it. I've had many examples of things like this. I've received a lot of ridicule, not unmixed with kindness, and a lot of malice, not unmixed with ridicule. I am used to it. That phrase, I am used to it, that sums up a lot of Lincoln's resilience. And then another thing which I think is very important is Lincoln's command of his subject as president. When Lincoln was elected president, he'd never been the governor of a state. He'd never been a senator, tried twice to get elected senator and did not succeed. He'd never even been the mayor of his hometown of Springfield. And now suddenly he's vaulted into the position of being the chief executive of the country. He had to have a very sharp learning curve, and he did. He learned the ins and outs of his job very quickly and very thoroughly, and he learned them better than anybody dreamt he could have learned them. And the illustration of this comes from a legal associate of his, Leonard Swett, who practiced law with him out on the old 8th Judicial Circuit in Illinois before the war. During the war, Lincoln would use Swett as a kind of personal ambassador. I want you to go and talk to somebody and see what their opinion is. One day, Swett came to the White House, and he was distraught over the way the war was going. He was convinced that all was lost. He was in despair. And he said Lincoln got out this little notebook that he kept in his coat. And in that notebook, Lincoln had recorded statistics, data, things you might find in an almanac. Things might be cut out of a newspaper and pasted into the notebook. And Lincoln walked him through that and said, all right, here's where the trends are going. Here's where we're going to be 6 months from now. Here's where we're going to be 18 months out. This is where it's inevitably going to lead us. And Swett came away from it just with all of the despair dispelled. Why? Because Lincoln had acquired such a grasp of the process of events that he could communicate a sense of confidence. This is where we're headed. This is where we're going to wind up. In the closing weeks of the war, Ulysses Grant asked Lincoln, "Was there ever a time when you doubted the outcome?" And Lincoln's response was, No, I never doubted the way things were going to turn out. I mean, he had his moments of anger and, why is this happening the way it's happening? But in the largest sense, he was confident from the very beginning that he understood where the trend lines were taking things. Once again, you're hearing canny politician, but a little whiff of Calvinist determinism.
Definitely.
But he had that coup of the eye that allowed him to understand what the internal workings of things were. He understood his job. He also made himself visible. I don't mean literally visible, because it would have been almost impossible in the 19th century, even with the transportation improvements, for a president to be constantly visible all the time and then still running the war from Washington. But he works to get visibility through the press and through this remarkable series of public letters that he writes, especially in 1863, letters that we sometimes call the Corning letter and the Conkling letter. Public letters. These are kind of the 19th century's substitute for a press conference. It's a letter written to an individual, but meant to be published as stating rationale and policy generally. Lincoln writes two marvelous public letters this way in 1863. And he goes on with other levels of communication. Like this, in the spring of 1864, a Kentucky editor named Albert Hodges, along with the governor of Kentucky, Thomas Bramlett, visited with Lincoln in the White House. And they had an admirable discussion. And afterwards, Hodges said, could you write out some of the points you made? Oh, yeah, Lincoln not only wrote out the points, he wrote out this whole disquisition, which he sends to Hodges for Hodges to reprint in the Louisville Courier. Again, Lincoln is making himself visible to the country as a whole. People will know from what he has written and published what he thinks the important parts of political life are. He is a marvelous communicator, but especially a communicator of visibility. So he has these aspects of democratic leadership, which are really unique to a democracy. I mean, in a monarchy, in a despotism, the things that are important are things like honor, power, conquest. For Lincoln, it's more like humility, resilience, knowing the task, visibility. Those are the things that he is able to master and to communicate at large. And I think those are some of the models that we can take from Lincoln as Lincoln's gifts to us
just today. So to close, we began with the Lyceum address. I want to end there. There's a line where he's talking about, if America ever were to come to its end, to meet its end, it wouldn't be through external invasion. It would be from within by suicide.
By suicide.
And so I know historians don't like to, project into the future or the present, but, would Lincoln think we are there today at that point of suicide? What would he make of this moment? What counsel would he offer us?
Well, I know that many people today have talked about an unprecedented atmosphere of crisis. I know that many people have made comparisons to the Civil War with the intensity of political polarization and conflict. And people have even talked about, from time to time, secession and breakup. Current issue of Harper's Magazine and that wonderful series it runs about the percentages, the Harper's Index. 1 in 4 Americans would be happy to see their state secede from the Union. I'm not sure how they acquired that number, but there it is on the Harper's Magazine website. And that raises the question in our minds, are we now facing a situation as critical, maybe even more critical than that which Lincoln faced? What would Lincoln tell us? Part of me wants to say, and this is the professional history person, I don't know. That's not what historians do. We are not prophets. And I keep having to resist the efforts that people sometimes make, I want to hope well-intentioned, to try to put words into my mouth. Like, well, he meant that. No. Historians are not prophets. That's a different gift. But I think that there are some things we can look at that Lincoln would direct our attention to that would be very helpful. One is, we have now been this experiment in Republican democracy for almost 250 years. That sets a lot of habits and expectations in place. One of the great weaknesses, for instance, of the Weimar Republic, trying to succeed Imperial Germany, but instead becoming Nazi Germany, was that Weimar hardly had a chance to sink any roots. Weimar was a sapling that got hit by a hurricane. We're not. We're an oak tree with deep roots, deep understandings, deep reflexes around democracy, freedom, liberty. And those roots are so deep and so instinctive in American life that I do not believe Lincoln would have seen them as being easily torn up. And that's to the good. There is, you might say, a resilience in American life today, built up by the capital of these 250 years. There's also a more practical consideration, and that is, no, we're not going to go into a crisis like 1860 to 61, if only because the kinds of polarization we see are spread out all across the country.
Geographic.
If in 1860, here's my contrast, if in 1860 slavery had been legal in Minnesota, Maine, Florida, and Louisiana, there would have been no Civil War. Why? Because they're so geographically remote. They can't support each other. They're not going to secede. The reason you have secession in 1860 to 61 is because all the slave states were geographically contiguous. They could see themselves as a separate nation state. That's not the situation that prevails now. We talk about red and blue states, but really the truth is that in every red state, there's plenty of blue blotches, and in every blue state, there's plenty of red blotches. In fact, in some blue states, the blue part is just the blotch. But we're not looking at the same kind of situation that we were looking at in 1860 to 61. And that's a good thing. That, I think, there should be a certain measure of comfort we take from that. Could we come to violent blows? We could see a situation, and I say this under the rubric of hope not. It could be a possibility of seeing a kind of low-level resistance that takes place in certain pockets. But even there, those pockets would be resisting a federal military armed with weapons of sophistication beyond even the comprehension of the 1860s. And I cannot for a moment believe that even a pocket of determined resistance could hold out for any length of time, or would even try. So on those terms alone, I think that Lincoln would tell us to calm down a little bit. It's not as bad as you think. We always think that it's worse than then. David Runciman said a very wise thing in a book he wrote about democracy. He called it How Democracies Die, but really the book is How They Don't. And in it he said something that I take a great deal of comfort from, and I think Lincoln would endorse. And that is that democracies have this curious habit of being vigilantly afraid of threats that never materialize and totally missing the ones that do. And yet, even the ones that they miss and that come along and knock them flat on their backs, democracies pick themselves back up and they triumph. Autocracies, monarchies, despotisms always look strong on the surface. But the minute they meet one serious bit of opposition, they crack and fall to pieces. That's very different from a democracy. We pick ourselves. Even when we get hit by something we weren't even looking for, we pick ourselves up. And I think that we worry too much about things that we don't need to worry that much about. We might want to keep our eyes and ears open for some things we aren't anticipating. But that is in the nature of a democracy. And I think it speaks to a longevity and a strength in democracy that we don't often attribute to it, but which I think our friend Lincoln would probably be the first to remind us of.
Well, on that note, thanks for coming on the show, Alan.
All right. Thanks so much.